If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com, HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. It's hard to believe that the holidays are over, and now, at least for me personally, I'm trying to get back into the normal world, out of the bubble of Tishrei. Of course, bringing all of the merchandise that we collected during the Chagim with us into the year. But what can you do? There's nothing like Simchat Torah, Sukkot, the great holidays. And so, to inspire us, Be'ezrat Hashem, to keep us going until Chanukah, I have a couple of Chassidic stories for you this week. But before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode in gratitude to our soldiers in battle. May Hashem bless them to be successful and keep them safe wherever they are. The returning of all the hostages alive and healthy. Be'ezrat Hashem. The refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is ill. The comforting of those that lost loved ones. And the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world. Everybody knows that the Jewish people in the late 1700s faced a real crisis. There was the Emancipation and the Enlightenment. And these two events, we're actually still dealing with them till today. So Emancipation was that Jews who were never allowed to be citizens before, especially if they didn't convert to Christianity, all of a sudden were allowed to remain Jews and become citizens, for example, in France and Germany, which was something unheard of before. And the Enlightenment was this idea of what basically we have today, modern atheism, which nobody believed in the past. Everyone believed in God. There wasn't even a question. People believed in different versions of God, but they weren't atheists. And here there was a movement which is called the Enlightenment. I mean, who doesn't want to be enlightened? Because what does that mean if you're not enlightened? You're one of the backwards people stuck in that boring black and white world, as opposed to us enlightened people, the world of art and philosophy and culture and music. And so many Jews were tempted to simply leave Judaism and become part of the general culture in France and Germany. And this was affecting entire Jewish communities, from parents to children, grandparents and great-grandchildren. And so Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, known as the Vilna Gaon, who was the leader of Lithuanian Judaism, who were the Litvaks or the Misnagdim, those that opposed the Hasidim. And just so you have a timeline of the Vilna Gaon, he was born in 1720 and passed away in 1797. So he was a contemporary of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe and the whole Chassidic movement. And the Vilna Gaon decided that he was going to take, in one version it says 10s, in other it says 10 of his most brilliant religious Torah scholars and send them to the universities in Berlin and in Paris to learn the new ideas that were being taught there, and then take those ideas and use them to strengthen Judaism in order to defeat those Jews that were leaving Judaism for the Enlightenment. Now, it was a risky move, but the Vilna Gaon was convinced that his students were so holy and so connected to Torah that there was no way that they would be swayed by atheism. And the students were convinced themselves. They went off on their mission knowing that they would be successful and would never become an atheist. But the power of the negative energy in the world is very strong because, as we know, it's Zelu Umat Asa. Hashem made juxtaposing energies. So in order for the good to be good, the evil has to be just as strong and just as tempting as the good. And so all of those students of the Vilna Gaon, except for two and what we'll call a half, abandoned Judaism completely. They became atheists. They threw off a life of Torah and mitzvot, even though they were great scholars and the closest students of the Vilna Gaon. The two exceptions was Rabbi Pinchas Eliyahu, who wrote a book called Sefer HaBrit, and the other was Rabbi Moshe Meislish, who eventually became a devoted follower, a chassid, of Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. And who was that half The half was Rabbi Shlomo Fagin. Now he had been inspired, just like the other students of the Vilna Gaon. Studying in Berlin also awakened within him a desire to throw off Judaism and embrace the world of philosophy and music and culture. But he had his doubts. Was this really the right path to take? And so, as opposed to the other two rabbis that I mentioned before, Rabbi Shlomo Fagin was kind of in between. And that's why we call him the half of the 2.5. He was in between until he met the Chassidim. He was a great Torah scholar and also a very successful businessman. And as he traveled around doing business, he happened to pass through the town of Liozne, where Rabbi Shner Zalman and the Chabad Chassidim were before they moved to the town of Lubavitch. And when he encountered the Lubavitcher Chassidim, he was surprised to see how joyful they were. They were serious about being happy. There was a spirit of warmth and camaraderie, something that he had never seen in the yeshivot in Vilna, where he had been brought up. And he went to one of the Farbrengens and listened to the Alter Rebbe speaking. He heard the Rebbe talk about Talmud and Kabbalah and Chassidic concepts. And he noticed that the Lubavitcher Chassidim, many of them were great scholars themselves, and for sure had Yirat Shamayim, an awe of God. And sometimes there would be small Farbrengens where the Chassidim would get together. They would drink and sing nigunim. Eat a little bit of old herring. They would tell stories and rebuke one another, but rebuke one another from love. Moshe would talk to Shlomi, and he would say, Shlomi, I see when you get called up to the Torah, you have a little bit of gaiva, you have a little bit of pride. Hopefully next time you get called up to the Torah, you'll be a little more humble. And Shlomi would say to Moshe, wow, you're so right. Thank you for pointing that out to me. You know, it's not enough to just criticize a person. The person has to be able to accept the criticism. And if you know that they can't, you probably shouldn't be criticizing them in the first place. But in a real Farbrengen, and I really miss those real Farbrengens, I haven't been to one in a long, long time. In a real Farbrengen, you can give rebuke to your fellow Jew, and he's open to receiving it. Be'ezat Hashem. Reb Shlomo Fagin, he felt like being amongst the Chassidim, something was different. He was different. In the past, he'd only heard bad things about the Chassidim, but now his soul was opening up to a new world of joy and meaning. And he no longer thought about leaving Judaism. Now he just wanted to be a chassid of the Rebbe. But the truth was, the time that he spent in the university in Berlin left some doubt in the back of his mind. And deep down, the doubt was coming and whispering in his ear. And one night the Rebbe was giving over a Chassidic discourse on the mystical aspects of washing hands for bread. And the Rebbe looked over and saw on Shlomo's lips that he had a strange, sarcastic smile on his face. And the Alter Rebbe interrupted himself and he said, it seems that Shlomo has a worm eating at his soul. And of course the smile on Shlomo's face went away very quickly. But the next day the Alter Rebbe called him into his room. He said, Shlomo, you're a businessman, right? He says, yes, Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe said to him, well, next time you're on business, if you happen to travel near the city of Karlin, would you please go and visit the great Rebbe of Karlin for me and send him my regards personally? And sure enough, a week later, Reb Shlomo was on business, and he stopped in the city of Karlin in order to see the Karliner Rebbe, like the Alter Rebbe had requested. The Chassidim pointed him to the Karliner synagogue, and when Reb Shlomo said he was there on behalf of the Alter Rebbe, they gave him a chair to sit in the hallway outside the Rebbe's door until the Rebbe was ready to see him. So he sat down and opened a book of Tehillim, of Psalms, and began to read. But then the strangest thing happened. From within the Rebbe's room, he heard a pacing back and forth very quickly. And furniture was being thrown around and things falling on the ground. Then all of a sudden the noise stopped. The door opened, and it was the Rebbe of Karlin himself, but only stuck his head out. His eyes almost bolting out of their sockets. He looked deeply into Shlomo's eyes, and shaking his head back and forth, he said, maybe God does exist after all? And then he pulled his head back into the room, slammed the door, and for a few more minutes he was pacing around, throwing things around. Then once again he opened the door, and he stares wildly at Shlomo, and he says, maybe, really, there is a God? And then he slammed the door and did it again. And he opens the door again. He said, maybe God exists. Maybe he really exists after all. After the door slammed the third time, Shlomo didn't wait to see the Rebbe. He couldn't take this anymore. He stood up, brushed his suit, and walked out of the Rebbe's shul. A few days later, there was a rumor that he had abandoned Judaism and disappeared. Apparently, the other half had finally gotten the best of him, and he had joined those who left Judaism for the Enlightenment.
Oy vey.
Many years went by, and Reb Shneir Zalman passed away when he was running away from Napoleon. It's a well-known story. I think I've told it on the podcast. Long story short, the Alter Rebbe knew that Napoleon knew black magic, that if he had caught up to the Alter Rebbe, he would have been able to tap into the holiness of the Rebbe. And so even though it was the middle of winter, the Rebbe fled from Napoleon. He even burned down his own house so Napoleon wouldn't be able to touch any of the items in his house and draw spiritual energy from them. And he ended up dying on the journey, fleeing from Napoleon. He asked to be buried in the town of Haditch, which wasn't where he died. Took a few more days for them to reach there. And that's where he's buried till today. A few years after the Alter Rebbe had passed away, the Tsar decided to build a new cross-country highway that it turned out was going to go exactly over the resting place of the Alter Rebbe. The Chassidim knew that they couldn't dig up the Rebbe's grave and move it. The Rebbe said he wanted to be buried there. They weren't going to change the Tsar's mind, that's for sure. So their only hope was to reach the Minister of Transportation and maybe get him to make a little change on the map. There was a rumor that the Minister of Transportation had once been a Jew, that had changed his religion, changed his name, and rose up in the ranks until he became a high minister in the Tsar's government with a huge headquarters in St. Petersburg. And of course, who was that person? It was none other than our friend Shlomo, who now called himself Stefan and had become a Christian, Rachmana litzlan. So now the Chassidim didn't know what to do. It was doubtful that they could get in to see the Minister of Transportation. And even if they did, who knows if he would be willing to help them. But they decided that one of the Chassidim, whose name was Moshe Valinker, who was a friend of Shlomo's in the old days when he was still a Chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he would make the visit and hopefully, with Hashem's help, be successful in his mission. The whole community davened for him, collected huge amounts of money to bribe the guards. And within a few days, Reb Moshe was sitting in the waiting room outside of the Minister of Transportation's office. His name was called, and he was brought in by two huge soldiers. When he came into the room, it was a beautiful, ornate room with gold and mirrors, beautiful furniture like he'd never seen in his life. And sitting behind the desk, the most beautiful desk he'd ever seen, was a clean-shaven, elegantly dressed minister that had a well-groomed mustache. And he looked at Reb Moshe and he said, "What do you want, Jew? Let's go, I don't have a lot of time. Get to the point." So Reb Moshe, he leaned forward to the minister. He said, "Your Honor, we have a great Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman. And when he passed away, he was buried in Haditch, where he specifically asked to be buried. And you have a highway that's going to go through his grave. Please, sir, we need your help." The minister says, "Ah, I see. You want me to divert the road? Well, if you want me to do a favor for you, you're going to have to first do a favor for me." Now Reb Moshe didn't know what was going to happen. He knew that the minister could do anything to him. Maybe the minister didn't recognize him. It had been many years. The minister rang a little bell on his desk, wrote a note and gave it to one of the soldiers, who saluted, turned around, and left. In the meantime, Stefan, who used to be Shlomo, and Reb Moshe were sitting there in silence, just looking at one another. And then the soldier comes back with a huge serving tray covered with a silver cover. Moshe had no idea what was under the cover. Maybe it was a piece of pork, and the minister was going to make him eat it in order to get the highway to be changed. Maybe it was a pistol, and he was going to shoot Reb Moshe. The Minister of Transportation waited for the soldier to leave, closed the door, and then he lifted the silver cover off the tray, revealing a bottle of vodka, 2 cups, and 2 small plates of herring and pickles. He looked at Reb Moshe and he said, "Moshe, if you want me to do you a favor, you're going to have to do me a favor first. Please, let's have a farbrengen, like in the old days." And so they drank together, and they sang Chassidic nigunim together, and they talked about the Rebbe and the ideas that the Rebbe used to teach them. And then the minister leaned forward and he said, "Moshe, I want you to know that the words of the Karliner Rebbe echo in my head constantly. Maybe there is a God after all. That's what the Rebbe said to me. Since I heard those words, Moshe, I can't get any pleasure from all the riches and power that you see here. Deep down, I want to go back to be with the Rebbe. Like in the old days." He took out a big map and he points to where the new road was supposed to go, right over the Alter Rebbe's grave. And he looks at Moshe and he says, "Moshe, you should know, today is kind of a miracle for me." And then he takes an eraser and carefully erased and redrew where the road was going to go, careful that it didn't enter the town of Hadich. Then he poured 2 more cups of vodka, and he said, "Nu, Reb Moshe, let's make another l'chaim." And Moshe went back to Lubavitch, and of course everybody wanted to know what happened. And he told them about the miraculous story that Stefan was Shlomo, and that Shlomo just longed to be a chassid. And it took an entire year, but a year to the day that Reb Moshe was in the office of the Minister of Transportation, a clean-shaven, a very elegantly looking man showed up in the court in Lubavitch with the beginning of a beard and a big smile on his face. And when he came over, he put his arms around Reb Moshe and he said, "Moshe, thanks to you, I'm here to be a chassid of the Mittler Rebbe. Thank you for having the guts and the courage to come and shake me out of my blindness and my darkness and bring me back to the true enlightenment, the enlightenment of the Chassidim." Shomer, Shomer Yisrael, Shemo Sherit Yisrael, Yan Yovan, Yan Yovan Yisrael, Yan Yovan, Yan Yovan Yisrael, Yan Yovan, Yan Yovan, Yan Yovan, Yan Yovan, Shomer, Shomer Yisrael, La la la, ya la la, ya la la, I have one more story for you. It's interesting, when I was picking these stories, I wasn't even looking at which Rebbes they were. I guess I have a lot of Lubavitch stories here. But there was a woman who was a chassid of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who lived from 1880 to 1950. And this woman, who was a devout follower of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, was married to a very religious man, but he wasn't a chassid. And they had shalom bayit, they were able to live peacefully together. Baruch Hashem, they had no marital problems. But one day, the husband, who was a businessman, came home and told his wife that someone had accused him of engaging in illegal activities. Word had gotten back to the police, and now he had to appear in court. He had already spoken with a top lawyer that said that this was a very serious matter, and that there was pretty much no way to win the case. The husband said to his wife, "I don't know what I'm going to do." And she said, "My dear husband, you have to go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and tell him about the situation and ask him what to do." The husband, as I said, wasn't a chassid. He says to his wife, "I understand the Rebbe knows Gemara, Kabbalah, Chassidus, but what does he know about legal matters?" And the wife said, "If he's the Rebbe, then he knows everything. There's nothing he doesn't know. Nothing." But the husband wasn't convinced. He was stressing over his case as it was getting closer and closer. The lawyer kept telling him, "I don't know what to do." He was losing sleep, going out of his mind. And so his wife said, "I told you have to go to the Rebbe. Stop stressing. Put your faith in the tzaddik and go to the Rebbe." So he went to the Rebbe in Poland, in Warsaw, and he told the Rebbe about the case against him. And the Rebbe said, "You have to go to Vilna, where there's a dentist. Visit him, and Be'ezat Hashem, you will be successful." This non-chassid businessman was so unimpressed with the Lubavitcher Rebbe telling him to go to a dentist in Vilna. He was upset. What did this have to do with his court case? When he finally got back home, he told his wife, "How can you be a chassid of this Rebbe? What is this, a joke? I have a toothache? I don't have a toothache. I have a court problem. I have a legal problem. I'm going to go to this dentist in Vilna, and he's going to say to me, 'Which tooth hurts you?' And what am I supposed to say to him?" And the wife said, "If the Rebbe told you to go to Vilna, then you go to Vilna. There's no other choice. The Rebbe knows everything. Go to Vilna." And once again, it took the husband a few days, maybe even a little longer, until he finally agreed to go to Vilna. There he finds the dentist, and he lays down in the dentist's chair, and the dentist says, "Open your mouth, what bothers you?" And the husband says, "Sorry, I don't have a toothache." So the dentist said, "So what are you doing here?" He said, "I came here because I have an unjust court case against me, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Warsaw told me to come here. The dentist says, the Rebbe sent you here? The guy said, yeah. The dentist said, come back tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So he left and returned the next day. And at 4 o'clock, the dentist told him to sit in the waiting room. And as he sat there, he overheard the dentist telling a patient about the case against the Jewish businessman. It's giving him all the details. He's telling him everything that the businessman had told him the day before. And now the businessman was getting upset. He said, this is personal information. Why is he just telling it to some patient that's laying on his chair? He was about to burst in the room and tell the dentist, you have some chutzpah, some nerve. But a few minutes later, the dentist came out of his room. He said, the man in my clinic right now is a judge. And I told him your problem, and he wants to hear it from you. Come in and tell your story to him. So the dentist and the businessman come in, and the judge listens. And he said, well, how do you defend yourself? And the businessman showed all the proof that he had that the accusations were false and baseless, that they were just accusations because he was a Jew, not because he'd actually done anything. And the judge says, what day are you supposed to be in court? He shows him the court date. The judge takes out his appointment book, looks at it, and then has a big smile on his face, and he says, you know what? I'm going to be the judge in your case on that day. Here's what we're going to do. You don't know me, and I don't know you. You'll show up on the day in court, and when I ask you to tell me your defense, you're going to say exactly what you said to me here without any hint that we've ever met before. And now that I have your information and your proof, I'll know how to cross-examine the other side. The businessman comes back home and his wife says, no, how was it by the dentist? And he told her everything that happened with the judge. And the wife says, no, isn't that a miracle? Now do you believe that the Rebbe knows everything? But the husband was not convinced. He said, it's true. I did end up in a random place and happened to meet the judge. It's going to be the judge of my case, but let's see how it works out. And the wife said to her husband, I have no doubt. As far as I'm concerned, it's a done deal. You're going to win the case and return home, and everything will be fine. And do you know how I know that? And the husband just stared at her. And she said, because I have belief in the Rebbe, something that you don't have yet, but we'll see. And of course, he showed up in court. He told the judge his side of the story. The judge, having prior information, cross-examined the other side, prosecution, and was able to prove that the Jewish businessman was actually innocent and there was no basis for the accusations against him. And so the case was dismissed. And when he came back home, his wife had a big smile on her face and she said, you don't even have to tell me. I already know that you won the case and that it was dismissed. And he said, you're right. I never would have believed it. Even if somebody had told me this story, even somebody that I knew, I would never have believed them. But now that it's happened to me, I have no other choice but to admit that the Rebbe truly does have holy vision. And whenever he would run into somebody that had difficulties or needed a blessing, he would always send them to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And if there were those that had a sarcastic smile on their face, he would tell them his story and say, I used to be just like you. But if you went through what I went through, you would never have any doubt in the Rebbe ever again. Thank you so much for listening. As always, my sweetest friends, it's such a pleasure to begin recording the stories again. And I want to thank all the supporters of the podcast, everyone who sends in contributions. I want you to know that it's greatly appreciated, and I acknowledge and see them all. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the listeners, and thank you to all the people that met me over the Chagim and told me that they listened to the podcast. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to become a supporter, my friends, just go to my website and you'll see a link on the site. Until next week, please take care of yourselves. We should hear good news, Bezrat Hashem, and sei gesund.
Oy vey.
V'Yaakov halach ledarko